What's up, guys, and welcome back to the channel where we learn, do, and talk about photography until we're sick of it. And on this stormy evening, I've got great news, both for those of you who've been watching with bated breath as I've tested the new Canon EOS R7 in all kinds of various uses and situations, and for those of you who just wish I would get back to doing regular in-the-field landscape photography videos. Today I'm going to test out the EOS R7 and make an assessment for it as a landscape camera, and I'm going to do that by making a photo here in the field. And so hopefully there's a little something for each of you to enjoy in this video. So the R7 boasts an impressive set of features, many of which I think will be of interest to landscape photographers, including its high resolution 32.5 megapixel sensor, its IBIS, and of course the improvements in image quality that seem to attend new camera releases. So hopefully in this video we'll make some determinations as to how far along those technological improvements have come to overcoming the barriers that we typically associate with crop sensor cameras, like lower dynamic range, higher ISO noise, and of course, the reduced field of view. So I'm gonna break this video into 3 easy sections. First, we'll look at some of the sample landscape photos that I've been able to make over the past almost 2 months of using the camera. And then I'm gonna show you the output quality samples comparing the R7 to other full frame counterpart cameras you might be considering, like the EOS R and the EOS R6. I've got side-by-side sample photos, comparison photos that I made in the same situation using all 3 cameras. And then finally, we'll come back and we'll make this photo together. We'll pull it into Lightroom and we'll edit it together and see how the raw files respond to some basic manipulations in Lightroom. That's usually the information that's most useful to me when I'm considering purchasing a camera for my purposes, but also some of the hardest information to get. So we've got a lot to go over in this video. Buckle in and let's get into testing the R7 in the landscape. The scene you see behind me is the victim of my photographic interest today. A really basic rural scene, but some conservation wetlands in the foreground, so that's providing a little more interest than maybe a typical cornfield or what you really will more often see when you're shooting rural scenes, like houses and cars and roads and power lines, right? This conservation area is giving me a nice long view to this little farmstead scene in the background. Shooting with the 100 to 400 millimeter EF f4.5 to 5.6 Mark II lens, and framed up with the R7 at about 200 millimeters. Just waiting for the colors to really approach their peak saturation, which should be sometime here in the next 15 minutes. Just taking some test shots now, which are looking great as the sky's taking on golden hues. But while I'm waiting for the sky to really light off with what hopefully is a fantastic post-storm sunset, or what I hope to be post-storm, frankly, it's feeling somewhat still mid-storm. I'm getting a little wetter than I intended when I came out to film the video. So I hope you enjoyed the reel of photos that I've been able to get out and make with the camera. I've sort of been, whenever it's possible, I've been using it as my primary landscape camera for the last 2 months, just so that I could give you guys this information. If you found it helpful, I hope you'll hit the thumbs up button and consider subscribing, because I do have just a few more tests on the R7 coming up. Next, I'd like to show you some side-by-side comparison shots of the R7 shooting the same scene as the EOS R and the EOS R6. So I made that comparison in the last video. I teased that there were sample shots of the R7 shooting the same scenes to come up later on the channel, so we'll feature them now in this video. If I were to summarize my findings from doing that experiment, I would say that my experience with the R7 was quite a bit like working with the EOS M6 Mark II, which is an older EFM mount mirrorless camera with essentially the same sensor inside, the same 32.5 megapixel sensor. And what I found when I was working out in the field with that camera, and there is a video, I'll link to that up here in a card. There's a video if you want to see that comparison. I compared it to the full frame EOS R. But what I found was that there are, of course, field of view limitations, but in addition to that limitation, I also found that there was noticeable difference in dynamic range. Where that really reared its head was when I was making exposure. I wasn't able to expose the EOS M6 Mark II as bright as the EOS R before the highlights hit the right side of the histogram. So all the exposures had to be made darker, and I had the exact same experience shooting with the EOS R7. So I'll put the differences in exposure times in the screen. I don't remember them right off the top of my head, but the R7 files had to be exposed darker, and so therefore the camera was getting less light, and so therefore there was the shadows clipped to black earlier, and therefore when I tried to raise the shadows in post-processing or make exposure adjustments, there was less detail in the shadows were noisier, and the character of the noise in the shadows was less contrasty and less receptive to sharpening adjustments. So it was just harder to work with the detail and make a good visually pleasing presentation of the detail and the shadows when I raised the exposure. So that's kind of typically my experience with working with crop sensor cameras. I would say the R7 is certainly no worse than crop sensor cameras I worked with in the past. If anything, maybe it's slightly better, but it's still not quite the result you would get from a full frame camera, either, of course, in the field of view or in terms of image quality. And when I looked at the high ISO noise results, they were basically the same, maybe a little better than crop sensor cameras I've worked with in the past, but not quite approaching the results that I would expect from my full frame cameras. And so, oh, you guys can't let me miss this. This is the shot that I came for. Let me grab this photo so that we'll have something to edit together. And then after we edit the photo, I'll conclude this discussion, which does basically contain my final thoughts on the R7 as a landscape camera. Before I get into them, a couple of things I wanted to remark on. First is that in the highlights, there's a surprising amount of noise that I encountered. This isn't necessarily high ISO noise. I made these at ISO 100, and this isn't like underexposure noise, so I'll cut a crop into this. And you can see that this is, basically the middle part of the histogram here, still a considerable amount of noise in the sky that I thought was worth pointing out. Something I've run into in crop sensors before, but I didn't necessarily expect it to see it in this newer model, and here it is for us to observe. So just an observation. Secondarily, you'll see that I do have two files. So these two comments touch on things that I mentioned earlier about limitations with crop sensor cameras, one being noise, and the other being limitations with the field of view. So as I was making the photo, I mentioned that I had framed it up at 200 millimeters, but as I went to take the shot, the sky opened up here in this area above the scene, and so I backed it out to 100 millimeters and still couldn't quite get it as wide as I wanted because I was shooting on a crop sensor camera. So I ended up making these two photos in a vertical panoramic that I'll stitch together in Lightroom. So just the kind of thing that you might find yourself doing more frequently, more work in the photo editor to overcome limitations like merging HDR brackets to overcome dynamic range limitations, making panoramics when you find you've hit the limit for your field of view and you can't get as wide as you'd like. And unfortunately, Canon has not expressed a lot of interest in developing APS-C lenses at wide angles that are of, even decent quality. I've used the EFS 10 to 18 and the 10 to 22. I'm not crazy about those. There's some third party options, but generally this will tie into my conclusion that while there are good options for you to get into a full frame camera, maybe the best time ever to be an entry level photographer getting into full frame wide angle landscapes with EOS RP and their new 16mm f2.8 prime lens. The R7 is probably not the first camera that I would recommend to you for that purpose. If you're looking for a more general purpose camera that can also do pretty good with landscapes, and it's a secondary type of shooting you do and you don't mind occasionally doing some of these workarounds to deal with the camera's limitations, the R7 can be a great camera for you. And there's one particular shooter in mind for whom I think the R7 is probably the best landscape camera that you can get. And I'll circle back to that after we play with these files a little bit, see how they react to a little photo editing. So like I said, the very first thing I'm going to do is group these photos together and go in and make a panoramic merge of them. So with the merge now, I've got a photo that not only shows more of the sky, but also sort of balances that with more foreground so that it's a little bit more of a balanced composition as opposed to something that would have been just focused on the sky. So we'll start here with some basic exposure adjustments. You can see where this sits on the histogram. It's a little underexposed because the light levels were dropping as I was shooting and I didn't take the time to raise the exposure. So we'll have a look at the settings: half a second at f11 and ISO 100 at 100 millimeters. And this has given us a panoramic of almost 40 megapixels, so that's great. So exposure adjustment, looking at the highlights, that is helping to even out a little bit of that noise. That's nice. I'd like to look here at this top portion of the screen. This is probably where we've got the most detail in the sky. We don't need to look at that quite so close. So what I usually look for here is that the detail, it retains this edge detail in these parts of the clouds, and also that there's a nice even, so you see we've got different tones here, darker tones, more middle tones, light tones, and that these don't like bleed together, and it sort of retains the edges and the roll-off areas between the transition areas between the brighter and darker parts. And it looks like we start to lose that right here at about 1.5 stops, where you can see this information is starting to approach the right side of the histogram. I would say that's perfectly acceptable to me. I would be happy to work with that. And then we can take it all the way down to black, it looks like, without really running into problems where the sky becomes mushy or crunchy. So pretty good performance with the highlights, but once again, this is considerably underexposed. Okay, so we'll move down and focus on the shadows a little bit more and raising the exposure. I don't know, I'm pretty happy with this. This actually is better than I expected. And we can take here where there's some of this these plants here in the foreground. We can take those basically all the way to white. So that's a pretty good latitude of exposure adjustment in the shadows. And in terms of the quality, I'd be happy to print this. I think this looks pretty good. Very little noise, pretty good retention of contrast. A little bit of detail lost here in some of these deeper shadows, but you'll keep in mind that this was shot at 100 millimeters in f11, so I don't expect this to be perfectly in focus. And so I'm also not therefore necessarily looking for the camera to preserve a lot of detail there in the foreground. Moving to the background here, this was also backlit and shot into the sun, and so also not a time where I'm looking for the camera to be able to preserve a lot of contrast, but what is here is pretty acceptable to me. I'm expecting that I'll be able to work through this file and make some generous adjustments to it. Okay, so I think we'll start by putting this at sort of a medium exposure. So we'll raise it to a point where the sky is not clipped and there's about the right exposure on the landscape for a moody evening landscape. So so for example, this would be sort of a properly exposed landscape, but I'm going to take it, this is plus 2.25 exposure adjustment, but I'm going to take that down to maybe something closer to 1.5 stops, positive exposure adjustment. And you can see, if you'll have a look up at the histogram, that that is not clipping the highlights, and we can then maybe just boost the shadows just a little bit. And maybe I'll go ahead and, because the lower portion of the foreground is too dark to, it sort of forms a boundary, a perimeter, keeping you from working your way into the scene. So maybe I'll just go in with a simple linear gradient and come in here to the lower portion of the photo and just boost those shadows up, and maybe just raise the exposure just a little bit, so that this is going to invite you into the scene a little bit more. And now I'll also go and make a similar simple adjustment to the sky with a linear gradient. I'm just going to lower the exposure, maybe kick the highlights down just a little bit, and maybe push the whites out. And then we'll play with this new tool, this fancy new tool that Lightroom has to let us make a selection just for the sky. And we'll see how well that works. So not too bad. I can see that the selection is getting down here into the foreground a little bit, and we'll see if that's going to help us or hurt us. Sometimes it helps make a smoother transition between the sky and the landscape, and then sometimes it causes some strange artifacts. So let's play with it a little bit. What I really want to do is darken the sky just a little bit more so that there's a little bit more definition to these clouds, but I don't have to darken it to get that effect. I can raise the contrast, for example. I can just lower the blacker parts. I can even push the whites out so that it looks just a little more natural. I don't necessarily look for a lot of detail in the sky, and like I said, this was a noisier part of the image, so I can lower the texture and give it a little bit of a dreamy look. I can lower the clarity just a little bit, and I can play with the dehaze slider and see if adding or removing haze from the sky, gives it more of the feel that I'm going for. And I like to have, I'm going to add about -5. I call it adding haze, but this is moving the dehaze slider -5. Okay, so, and then with all those adjustments, I'll revisit the exposure slider and make sure that these tones sit in a place that makes sense with the rest of the landscape. Now there's a little bit of discord here with the color. I'm going to go back down to the bottom and add a little bit of red tint to this, because this would be reflecting red light from the sky if it was catching light, but unfortunately I shot it in a way that it didn't really record very much of the light that was reflecting off of it. And now basically the whole photo is too red, but it's all too red together, and I can make a global tint adjustment to slide it back to the green. And you'll watch, it's just sort of like I'm taking a red haze away from the photo. When I move the tint slider back to green, and I see that the file is responding to these white balance adjustments really favorably. I like this quite a bit. And I'll make sure that the warm and cool slider is also set at a place that makes sense. So for example, if I move it to the warm side, you can see that it starts to take the character and feel of a sunset or sunrise photo. When I move it to the cool side though, I can sort of neutralize those warm colors and bring a little bit more vibrance back into the landscape at the expense of some color in the sky. I'm going to leave it at a nice medium point right there. So now these colors all make sense together for me. They're just a little bit muted because what I've really done is gone through and done a lot of work to neutralize the colors that are a little heavy. So now I'll use the vibrance and saturation sliders to bring color back into the photo globally so that the level of saturation here is matched throughout the photo. I don't have parts of the photo that are screaming at me and parts of the photo that look very muted and subdued. So this is starting to look like a fairly cohesive photo to me. And I think I can go back into my sky selection and take, is this the right one? This one. And take a little bit of the color out of the sky. Okay, so that the level of colors again just sort of is matching throughout the photo, and then I'll go back in and globally raise the saturation of the photo a little more. And now this oranginess in the foreground is probably a little bit too strong. I don't want that to be the strongest colors in the photo. This is another problem that I run into a lot with cheaper cameras, is this extremity of oranges. And so I'm just going to grab that and drag it down. Just target those specific colors and drag the saturation values down so you can see that the oranges and the yellows have gone down now in the hue, saturation, and luminance panel. And at that point, I can then start to raise the saturation of the photo globally again. At this point, I think we've got a pretty nice little peaceful, serene farmland sunset scene. It's just a bit too bright for me now. But again, I've got everything in the photo balance, so I can make these adjustments globally. And I can set this for a nice bright scene like this, or like maybe a super dark, moody, stormy scene like this. But I'm going to put it somewhere in between. So I've got that for about 1.25 stops positive. We'll wrap this off with a nice soft vignette around the photo to really frame that barn in. And that's making me want to brighten the photo then again just a little bit. And I'm happy with it right here, right where it is. So had no trouble at all editing this file and very happy with the results. And as I promised, I'll tie this into a discussion about where I'm comfortable recommending the R7 as a landscape camera. So if you are primarily a wildlife shooter and you're working with an older DSLR and the improvements that the R7 offers you for your wildlife shooting are not enough to convince you to move to the R7, and you're considering or have wanted to, and this is, I know a lot of wildlife photographers in this situation, have wanted to incorporate landscape shooting into your work and to be able to offer attractive landscape print products, for example, screensavers, desktop backgrounds, to incorporate them into your videos. I think the R7, if you're not already persuaded by what it has to offer your wildlife photography, the extra capabilities that high resolution sensor and these very capable files are going to offer you should definitely be persuading you to lean towards picking up this camera for your wildlife workflow. So I think for a wildlife photographer, I would have no problem recommending this as an upgrade to an older DSLR you might be using to sort of open up some new avenues to help build interest to your work. And that's not even mentioning the considerable video capabilities that the camera also offers, which we haven't really remarked on much on the channel, but that is the concern of my next video. So if you'd like to see some comparison testing of the video quality of the R7, looking at it compared to other Canon cameras like the R6, the EOS R, even the M6 Mark II, I've got a side-by-side comparison video coming up for that. As I mentioned, I've purchased the camera primarily for myself as a video camera, so I'm getting all the other benefits that I've been showing off on the channel basically for free, because I think just in the video capabilities alone, the camera sells itself. So if you want to see those comparisons, be sure you're subscribed. And that video comparison is going to be the penultimate video leading up to my final conclusions video after using the camera for over 2 months at the point that I produced that video. So lots of good R7 content still coming up from the channel, and that's going to lead back into regular in the field landscape photography for the fall foliage season. We're going to take some trips around the Midwest and show off some of the best fall foliage that the Midwest has to offer. So I encourage you to subscribe, and until I see you next time, you guys keep an eye out and a foot forward, and thank you for watching.